Last speaker of this semester, and we save the best for last. My job is to introduce her, and then you to introduce yourselves as well, and then you'll speak for a bit of time, and then we'll have Q&A and open it up. Nadya is, I guess I call it the premier strategist, or one of them anyway, of the foundation world, and has had a lot of experience both at the Pew Charitable Trust, where you worked for 12 years, and then at the Rockefeller Foundation. Hi, Artie. And then the Rockefeller Foundation, where she's just really left and is taking a bit of a breather, that's fair to say. We have, because I know some of you now, I'm pretty much a newbie, but we have people from 4 or 5 different schools here, which is really terrific. And I think you could probably take them all on and figure it out. So what I'm going to do is ask us to run around so you know who they are. So Joel, why don't you begin?
I'm Joel Fleischman. I teach in public policy. I teach about foundations and nonprofits and ethics.
Mike?
I'm Mike Borsberger. I'm the Vice President of Development Alumni Affairs for Duke Medicine.
I'm Ted Fisk. I'm an education journalist. I'm Joel Huber. I'm a professor in business school.
I'm Anirudh Krishna. I'm a professor here in public policy.
Hey, Loda, your husband and chauffeur.
I did half the driving.
Did you drive all the way down?
Companion is the phrase.
Well, to drive or flew, depends on how you want to describe
Kind of
it.
the Ford Motor Company.
Doing our part.
Hi, I'm Anita Shirley, and I'm Assistant Director of Foundation Relations Medical Center. Also, in a different life, I wrote directors of foundations in North Carolina, Virginia, and Georgia.
I'm Kathleen Burnett with the Kingman Charitable Trust in Chapel Hill.
I'm Reed Gilbert. I'm an undergraduate here.
Hodden Carter at UNC, Chapel Hill Public Policy.
Sarah Burdick with the Center for Strategic Philanthropy and Civil Society.
Charlie.
Charlie Blockfelder, I'm on the faculty here.
Barry Varela. I'm the case writer for the Center for Strategic Philanthropy and Civil Society.
I'm Wendy Caron. I'm an associate dean at the business school.
I'm a visiting professor here this year from George Washington.
Hi, I'm Allison Dahl. I'm a student here in public policy.
Can't hear you, a little louder.
I'm Allison Dahl. I'm a master's student in public policy.
I'm Mary Dawson. I'm also a master's student in public policy.
I'm Saki Zhang. I'm also a master's student in international development policy.
Hi, I'm Christine Reeves. I'm a master's in public policy student.
Ray Nazer. I'm a master's in international development policy as well.
I'm Rosemary Brainholtz. I'm teaching public policy.
I'm Paul Rapp, I'm an undergraduate here.
Michael McCard from the business school student. Lee Berliner, second-year student at the business school.
I'm Elizabeth Runkle, and I'm a first-year student at the business school.
I'm Mary Sherhart. I'm not from Duke. I'm from NC State. I'm the director of the Institute for Nonprofits.
I'm Julia Bale. I'm a writer with the Philanthropy Journal.
I'm Bibi Gwill. I'm Director of Development with the Duke Institute on Caribbean Philanthropy Family School.
I'm Richard Payne, professor of medicine and divinity at the Institute for Caribbean Life.
Allegra Young, the assistant to the dean at the Divinity School.
There we go. I think we got everyone. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Nadya, and enjoy it. And you will.
Well, it's a true honor for me to be here today, and one piece that you may or may not know is that I'm actually a Duke University baby. I grew up here until I was 10, and that's a large part of the reason my husband's come down here with me as well, so that we can go and visit my old home for the first time since then. I also am particularly privileged to be here because Joel and Ed are two of my greatest heroes from the philanthropic sector. Joel, I knew of his scholarship and his reputation for years before I had a chance to meet you, and was always awed by him, and particularly when I found out you were the Vanity Fair wine critic. I was so excited. that trumped everything, but it's really been a privilege to get to know him in the last few years, and we even now serve on a board together, which is, again, a great honor. And Ed, his reputation preceded him as well in my years as a practitioner in philanthropy. I knew of him for many years, more of his words from CERDNA, and CERDNA is a foundation we can talk about in a bit, which, as he always used to say, he liked to take it to fight above its weight class. And he did a brilliant job at both leveraging the money and the thinking behind the philanthropy of Cerna, and actually was really a thought leader for many of us in philanthropy in many ways. So you're incredibly blessed to be able to benefit from both of these gentlemen, and I am honored to be invited here. And I will just say before I start, I am most decidedly not an academic. I am, on a good day, a reflective practitioner. And as Ed said, I haven't even been a practitioner for a few months. So, but this has been a nice opportunity for me to reflect. And I think if you can bear with me, I actually did prepare some just formal thoughts and words for this, and then I hope that'll stimulate some Q&A. And I'm a little mindful of Ed's introduction in terms of me being a premier strategist, because yes, I've done a ton of work in strategy, but if you took a look at the title, which I know seems maybe a bit trite, it really, I really do think it's about the people. And so a lot of my talk is around that, and I'd love to debate and reflect on that with you. I do think foundation effectiveness is, at the end of the day, all about the people. Strategy is important, but the people matter. For all of the logic models and theories of change that flow into foundations, at the end of the day, there needs to be an alignment of personal talent, both in foundations and among grantees, in order to execute foundation strategy effectively. I know one of your sub-themes for these talks is strategic choice making, and I'll say to you that I think the strategy portion of this equation gets way too much attention, and the human dimension responsible for choosing the strategies that can be effectively implemented is supremely underattended. I'd argue it's the elephant in the room in most foundations, and that in many instances the level of detail in a given logic model flowchart can be subterfuge for effective leadership and management for a foundation of a foundation's people. I'll note, for example, and that all through looking at the titles of the topics for these seminars over the last 6 years, I've never seen an explicit reference to the importance of the people to the successful implementation of strategy. And I'm sure the people issue came up in many of your presentations, but I think their importance is really front and center. I'm going to share a little bit about my background so you can understand my biases, and perhaps we can have a conversation or even a debate sparked by those experiences. I would consider myself an inadvertent foundation professional. I stumbled into this by accident, having met the now president of the Pew Charitable Trust, Rebecca Reimel, old friend of Joel's, I know, in a class in business school. At that time, I was focused on healthcare issues, and she gave me the opportunity to work as a program officer on both domestic and international health issues. I'd intended for it to be a 3 to 5 year stint, and it turned out to be 22 years, and I still haven't fully gotten out of it. When I started at Pew, we were a tiny staff working for a family that directed its philanthropy, primarily local and almost entirely anonymously. And we were housed in the back of the investment firm that the family had established to manage their assets. And we had everything borrowed from the bank, including its human resources and personnel policies. In fact, the person who ended up being my best friend at the Pew Charitable Trust turned out to have applied for a job that was advertised in the Philadelphia Inquirer for a bank teller. And the prevailing thinking at that time was that there was only one skill set that was needed to give out the money, and a bank teller was as good as a charitable officer. And I kid you not. And as Pew emerged, we actually got our own letterhead, separate from the bank, and my role changed from being a program officer to being more of an administrator and an executive leader of the foundation. One of the questions I always ask people in job interviews is to describe a peak professional moment and explain why it was so. And for me, that peak moment and period was those first couple of years when I moved out of programs and into administration at the Pew Charitable Trusts. And our board had given us a mandate to forge a national identity for ourselves, to get off the Glenby Company letterhead and actually become a foundation of our own. Rebecca became the new president, and we began to recruit a whole new team of people to lead the foundation, although I will admit that we also said goodbye to a lot of people as we brought new people in the door. 3 of us who had been in program positions moved to non-program roles, me to administration, another to evaluation, and another to grants management. In retrospect, this turned out to be a really brilliant move because all 3 of us knew the work of grant making and had credibility and insight into the Foundation's core business. We brought in 6 new talents to lead each of the program divisions, a new communications director, and an executive vice president to work with our president. The 10 of us for about 2 years had a wonderfully creative space in which to borrow best practices from other foundations, but also to imagine and invent a whole new foundation. Importantly, all under the watchful eyes of a constant board of family members. Their steady and close guidance taught me invaluable and formative lessons about family stewardship. As I said, what we had during that period was the remarkable chance to invent with probably the best creative team I've ever had the privilege to work with. Importantly, we were given the freedom to take programs in different strategic directions based on external conditions, and frankly to follow personal predilections and talents of the respective directors. What I thought turned out to be the best move we ever made in those early days was to ask each of the incoming program directors to craft a white paper for the program areas. The broad parameters were set by our board, whether it's that we had education, health, cultures were givens, and they also gave us a few no-nos, like don't establish partnerships with communist governments, which I fell into inadvertently. Learned that lesson. But each director had the creative space to reflect on future opportunities in their respective fields. And these papers turned out to be a pretty important acid test for their potential performance and served as a useful management tool for us. Revealed their ability, or not, to develop the papers on a timely basis, which sounds basic, but you'd be really surprised. To assemble the right external inputs from consultants, academics, grantees, and other foundation partners. Importantly, to be able to paint a picture of a desired end state for their line of strategy in the field. And that sounds really basic, but you'd be surprised how hard it is to get a grant maker to really paint the picture of what they're trying to achieve. To be able to build that strategy logically and in a way that was respectful and inclusive enough of the trust's history and relations externally. And finally, and vital to success, to make the gut check that they had enough information that they could actually choose a strategy and that it was a strategy that they were passionate about. At the end of the day, too many of the strategy and impact assessment processes instituted at foundations suck the lifeblood out of the creative and passionate impulse, I think. And I believe they can drain innovative thinking. Yes, a strategy needs to have a beginning, middle, and anticipated end. Yes, there need to be benchmarks for progress built in, an external review to test assumptions and correct against biases. But no, I don't think it's wrong for an officer to believe with passion in what they're doing. I'm not saying that the best grant makers are by their nature blind advocates, but neither do I think that the most objective scholars make effective grant makers either necessarily. The best grant makers I've ever seen, in many ways, had the skills of good investigative journalists. They have a hunch. They know how to test their hunch and assumptions by identifying knowledgeable and legitimate sources. They do so in a timely way. And at the end of the day, they have enough confidence in their gut with the information they've amassed that they can go to press credibly. I do think there's a critical role for academic research in shaping and underpinning philanthropic strategies. But frankly, I found more often than not that a research orientation is not necessarily linked to a grant maker's effectiveness, as it sometimes competes with the action orientation needed to move the work on a timely basis. In other words, to keep the presses moving. Being able to identify and access the deepest subject area specialists is vital, but I don't believe it's necessary and can even be counterproductive for a program professional to get him or herself lost in the research. Successful officers need to be able to think strategically and act decisively without getting bogged down in too much data or confused. I will say some of the most effective grant makers have been among the most frustrating people I've ever had to manage. My guess is you'd share this philosophy. Yes. Because the creative tension of holding them just enough within the foundation boundaries can be difficult. With strong management, however, and a willingness to make them better by testing their assumptions, I do believe that it's okay to welcome in the passion of a grant maker. That's how strategies ultimately do get implemented, because someone cares both inside the foundation and on the ground among the grantees. Over 5 years ago, I did a study on foundation strategies for attracting and managing talent that's actually still on the Foundation Center's website. I interviewed foundation leaders in 13 of the largest private foundations, as well as their human resources directors. And one of the clear findings was the inherent murkiness of a foundation leader's management dance. The program professional role has inherent creative tensions, and the nuanced skills of a good foundation leader are needed to dance that dance with grace. A series of tensions in the core competencies that are needed in the program officer role are, on the one hand, passion and advocacy, on the other, objectivity, having analytical skills, as well as leadership and interpersonal skills, having academic specialization, but also a results orientation, having a strategic focus, but always still being able to listen to others, having individual expertise, as well as a proclivity for teamwork and facilitation skills, having a strength of external networks and internal leadership and management skills, and finally, having that program vision thing, but also needing a strong attention to detail. And those continua all came from foundation presidents that I spoke to during that period. And a president has the responsibility for trying to balance that in any given individual, but also in the officer cadre of the organization that he or she leads. I would argue that finding the right people for the right jobs is perhaps the most important challenge that any foundation CEO will face. One foundation president I interviewed for the study noted, we experienced two challenges: the program officer who may have subject area expertise, but who's unable to turn that expertise into strategic program design, or the great strategist who's unable to execute and manage through the myriad of complex relationships necessary to achieve program success. And on that note, there's often a failure to recognize what the core work of a program professional is, many times because foundation presidents have had no prior working experience in the sector. The first mistake is failing to understand that the program professional does not directly lead change, but rather facilitates change through the work of grantees and other partners. It's a facilitative role. The work of a grant maker can be more tedious and administrative than folks imagine, and there's limited understanding of the day-in, day-out responsibilities of program staff. The work includes, and this is going to sound boring, much of it, but it's the work, the analysis of grantee capacity, working with grantees to modify their grant strategy and approach, staying abreast of the field more broadly through the literature and in some instances publishing, representing the foundation at meetings and conferences, possibly managing media inquiries, turning down the vast majority of grantee inquiries for funding, but still serving as a technical resource to these organizations wherever possible, structuring and managing grants once they're approved, and troubleshooting with grantees through the life of their grants on a range of issues from strategy refinement to management or fiscal problems. Most likely, they're also managing staff and consultants, and perhaps most onerous of all, getting ready for the next in an endless stream of board cycles, with what I would say is more often than not a disproportionate focus. And Joel has certainly commented and written about this in the past. Board prep is perhaps the most consuming part of foundation life, and one that begs a better balance somehow. I do think part of the beauty of the Pew experience for me was that our main job in those early years was to identify and find new talent and let it flourish, and in turn, new people brought in their own new networks, and those grantees and new partners ultimately were the implementers of any of our successful strategies. It was a young and energetic team, and creativity was valued. In my view, the most talented programmers moved on after they'd run their strategies up a flagpole, and most moved back into the field where they could take a different approach or tack at effecting change. The danger of staying too long in these roles is not just the staleness of ideas, but more critically the stagnation of networks. A key element of philanthropy should be the identification and elevation of new talent, and inevitably a long-tenured grantmaker will rely, at least to some degree, on a tried and true stable of talent. And again, I believe that every foundation simply has too many choices in its potential strategic direction. And frankly, there is no one right way. Bringing in people with new hunches and approaches refreshes the investment in ideas and people. I don't believe in a hard and fast rule for program staff turnover. Some foundations do that. But I do believe in foundation leaders who are willing to engage in transition discussions with staff from the day they walk in the door, and who have the insight and courage to make changes when it's time. And as a footnote, that doesn't happen very often. I left Pew after 12 years in an effort to rebalance my life a bit with 3 young children, though again inadvertently found myself with an interesting consulting practice, largely with foundation leaders and boards as my clients. And over 7 years as a consultant, I actually found that my message got simpler and simpler. Yes, strategy matters deeply, but aligning talent to craft and evolve that strategy and providing the management discipline organizationally to execute for impact matters more than anything. In that vein, I was a consultant to Rockefeller for 6 or 7 years. Then when Judy Roden was brought in as new president, the board chair suggested that she meet me to get an outside-in perspective on what she was inheriting. After we met, she asked me to join her when she started for an interim 6-month gig as a vice president, so that she could learn more about the job and the place before replacing the 3 vice presidents who were leaving. I was pleased to do so, as one of my greatest frustrations has been watching new leaders come into foundations who don't know what the work is before making hiring decisions that are often misguided and that are a lot harder to undo than to do. And I really respected her patience and openness to learning about the business in this regard. Long story short, 6 months turned into 3.5 years, and commuting back and forth from Philadelphia to New York. And I rotated around to 5 different roles during that time. What compelled me was the rare opportunity to update a foundation that had known greatness at one time, but had in my eyes stagnated, and in large part because of an unwillingness to reassess talent in light of current conditions and strategic challenges. Success can indeed breed success, but can also perpetuate adherence to approaches and attitudes that sometimes lead to an invented here first attitude. And this was true at Rockefeller, both on the program and operational sides. So among our main challenges were to find ways to build upon the foundation's significant past successes, legacy, and reputational capital, while at the same time helping to shift and reposition the institution into a current landscape that was markedly different from when many of the early successes were enjoyed. A shift that involved a reassessment of the requisite skills of the staff. As one example of the many shifts required in staff skills, I facilitated a retreat for Rockefeller back when I'd been a consultant, and we were trying to brainstorm a list of core competencies that program staff needed to have. And a program officer who had been with the foundation, if you can believe it, for over 35 years at the time, described how when he had started, it was pretty easy to know what was needed, where the opportunities lay, and whom to contact to effect change. He noted that now, however, with an explosion of nonprofit organizations, a multi-dimensional donor community, public and private partnerships, and media and technology streaming information at a frenetic pace, he felt that he needed eyes not only in the back of his head, but on top and everywhere else in order to assess the landscape in which he worked. This clearly requires new skill sets that need to be explicitly recognized, searched for, and developed among staff. In this officer's case, he made the shift and has now been there almost 40 years, and he turned out to probably be my favorite program officer of the whole place. Many, many others, however, did not make the transition. And what started out as a minor course correction evolved into a major strategic change effort. We tried to instill a willingness and ability to look outside the walls of the Rockefeller Foundation more systematically and rigorously, and to test assumptions upon which much of the work and internal practices had been based for years. We made hard choices and decisions about people who were unable, or perhaps more importantly, unwilling to do so. And I'd argue to you that this is a vital part of foundation strategic choice making. How you assess and align your talent to meet strategic objectives over time. In all that we did, we worked very hard to bring in external perspectives and sources of data to challenge our underlying assumptions. The data itself proved to be a very important part of the change process and helped us to raise the bar on performance. I'll also say that one of the crucial elements of foundation effectiveness is the ability to integrate across program and operational units. Again, something that is not a hot topic for research, and I will harken back in my days at Pew. I learned this, as I said earlier, when Rebecca moved 3 of us from the programmatic to non-programmatic leadership roles. As I said, it's turned out to be key in ways that weren't anticipated, because our understanding of the core business allowed us to both add value to programs and, importantly, hold our colleagues accountable. There are countless ways in which collaboration, partnership with finance, grants management, human resources, evaluation, or communications enrich programmatic effectiveness. But sadly, many foundation leaders and program staff have no appreciation for the importance of these functions, with the possible exception of evaluation and communications. But even with evaluation, for example, working effectively with the program staff requires an appreciation of the work of programs. And without that, evaluation staff are too readily dismissed, even though their work and input is essential for strategic refinement toward greater impact. I'd say that just as in hospitals where nurses may be treated as second-class citizens, so are non-program staff and foundations, even though they, like nurses, are the lifeblood of the institution in many ways. What I learned early on in my work at Pew is that it's the people in the administrative jobs who are also the ones who are truly there for the organization. Most of them could work anywhere in the private sector, but they choose foundations because of their missions and they believe in them strongly, and they take pride in the institution. Program staff, frankly, are more often than not embedded in their external field networks more than they are in the organizational culture of the foundation, which is a natural challenge to manage in all foundations. How that's managed by top leadership has a great deal to do with developing and maintaining an effective culture. The second-class citizen dynamic was a particularly difficult one to eradicate at Rockefeller, particularly for a culture that grew up from a legacy of linen tablecloths for the program staff in the formal dining room and a basement cafeteria for the administrative staff. And this was a legacy that lingered in the memory of some of our longer tenured employees. Another lesson I learned, again dating back to my Pew days, is the importance of the family legacy. The Pew family still dominates that organization's board, and I think it provides an invaluable perspective and discipline for foundation members to be accountable to the family whose wealth was donated under their family's guiding values toward a purpose and mission. One of my richest professional experiences was being asked 3 years ago to join the Surdin Foundation board as one of its first non-family board members. As Ed knows, I consider it a true privilege to serve among 4th and now 5th generation members of the Andrus family, which is Surdin spelled backwards, or Surdin is Andrus spelled backwards, I should say. I also joined that board about the same time I was starting my interim gig at Rockefeller, and my colleagues there would say when I came back into the offices after Surdin board meetings, I was Surdinified, which basically meant I was invigorated by the passion and the true beliefs of the family members and their own belief in the importance of that charitable trust. Not to mention your bad jokes. That was another thing.
He hasn't given up.
No, I don't hear that. I'm generally fascinated by the continuing evolution of a family institution past its first and courageous professional leader in the form of Ed, and with their openness to bringing in new skill sets among the board. Again, I feel it's about the people, and in this case, the donor's family. And speaking of people, among the changes I am most proud of that we were able to make at the Rockefeller Foundation was that we brought a Rockefeller family member back onto the form in the form of David Rockefeller Jr. He is a remarkable man, and his mere presence in the room makes staff think twice and with greater discipline about the value and impact of every dollar spent. I truly believe this. In case in point, when I left this summer, I wrote letters, goodbye letters, to my favorite board members, each of whom I respected in one way or another. Not surprisingly, the one personal letter I received back was a beautiful note from David, something I will treasure always, evidence of his true sense of stewardship for that institution. He models philanthropy in his quiet but always thoughtful oversight. Not only was he clearly raised right, but I truly believe his passion for the Foundation's mission will do more to ensure its effectiveness than any strategy paper or logic model. And I'm happy to talk more about any of these topics, but I would urge those of you who are researching the field of philanthropy to look more closely at the role of people in the achievement of a foundation's mission. Foundations are not academic enterprises, but are instead output organizations, something that is not well understood. As such, they require greater attention to internal management and leadership capabilities, something that has not been consistently appreciated either. And this focus on talent needs to include the people who govern private philanthropies, the people who lead them, the people who make choices about where to place strategic bets and programs, the people who manage the ancillary services that make these investments stronger, and most importantly, the people who foundations partner with through their grants and convenings to effect actual change on the ground. To me, effective strategies for identifying and developing these people are the most critical success factors for foundations. And I thank you for indulging me in the written word, and I would be more than happy to debate or discuss any of this.
Thank you, Nadya. We're delighted to be indulged upon. I just want to make a short remark, which is that not only is this truly, I think, a beautiful rendition of the story of many foundations that we know, but we in the audience represent theology school, the business school, public policy, and I'm forgetting one too, but and some semi-much in the private sector, and much of what is being talked about has relevance to all of us in our different worlds, whether it's the private sector or the academic world and so forth. So there's lots to think about. Thank you very, very much for that. Let's roll it out.
Can I ask,
Joel, do you want to
I
start?
want to ask Hotting.
I was going to ask
I want to ask Hotting to reflect on this, on several points, but particularly.
I was
the
thinking
issue
how
of
lucky you were in the nature of your boards.
Yeah.
Oh, we could talk.
No, I actually I'd rather reflect some more, because I was sitting here incorporating a number of themes that you had, so many of which speak to me. I mean, beginning with the notion that part of the task is to be a good investigative reporter in the way you approach
Funny
that.
thing, then.
But I must say just one thing in passing, because as all my friends here know, passion is not a commodity with which I'm unfamiliar, but it has absolutely no moral value whatsoever. I mean, and some of the people I've seen on some boards were full of passion and utterly destructive because they wouldn't harness it within the realm of what had been decided with strategy and what have you, and were determined, that by the force of will and passion they were going to either guide it or wreck it. And this is just one little passing thing I would note from experience from other times and other places. I couldn't agree more, however, that structures are more sterile than passion is without moral principle. I mean, structures have no particular standing without the absolute guidance and implementation of people, and the people in the end of the day matter, as they do everywhere. I mean, each one of you all in your various lives know that. I'm a little concerned that right down to it, you've seen a very precious slice of foundation life. And the other 65,000 foundations, more or less, or many of the other 2,200 rather. I mean, there are other models that have, I think, not been as conducive. I was thinking about you guys sitting back there at Pew. I still am amused when I think about it, given what that family actually represented and what the stewardship could have been, given where and who that came from.
It's a remarkable story.
No, it's a remarkable story, but I have to tell you, it also is somewhat a matter of blind goddamn luck, because those people were raving madmen.
There's also the charm of the leader too.
Yeah, but I was thinking about Tom. I was thinking about Tom before I was thinking about.
Oh, sure.
I mean, Tom was the absolute precursor. He might not have been John the Baptist, but he damn well cut a lot of ground.
He was the first outsider. This was the president before Rebecca. He was the first real outsider.
And he was, he's responsible for Rebecca's ascension. But it could have gone a lot of other ways in that foundation alone. I mean, it just needs to be noted. As for the rest of it, I think it's amazing that Rebecca was smart enough to do the way she did it. I like the way in which you gracefully spoke of the 3 departing vice presidents, as though it were mistakes were made or they departed.
That was Rockefeller. Well, I think I go both places. There were some people that did.
Yeah, I mean, who just did not walk out saying thank you for the chance to walk out the door, I guess is what I'm really saying. But how much of an argument with you?
Well, I wanted to
This will be the first time of any speaker.
Yeah, this is unusual, very unusual. Yeah. But I was just curious, what about, do you agree with what Nadya said about family, the importance of family, in connection, just reflecting on your own experience with that?
No, I don't. But then again, I do if it works. I mean, that is to say, as a person who's worked in several family enterprises, I have a very strong sense of what stewardship taught to me. I also have a very strong sense that a lot of people use the family name to be destructive of several things, not least being many of those who founded these institutions were wise enough to understand that being frozen in time and position was precisely not what they expected. But some I saw in some places, I won't go into all the places, I saw people invoking 40-year-old positions of a family, as though the family had never evolved in the 40 years before that. That is, they were going to be the stewards, a nice word for David Jr., stewards of a tradition which was not relevant even at the end of the day to those who were the founders.
And you're talking about board members, family
members who really were frozen in time and kept invoking daddy or granddaddy on issues about at least one of which they had changed themselves, but not when the particular family members were growing up. So they were speaking to a place in which they had been frozen in time. Me, I have to say, finally, one last thing on this one. If you don't want to watch something happen to your money that you might not have intended, don't give endowments, give ample grants. I mean, that is to say, there's no way that you do not have a rolling change over time between the moment of founding and the moment in which you, the third generation of consultants, arrive. I mean, it's nobody to save it. And David himself can hardly be said to reflect every one of the worldviews of some other Rockefellers I can think of.
I think that's right, and I think, but there is a sense. I think it diffuses the ability for staff to do that interpretation of the family. Or I mean, I've seen staff interpret what and I think having a family member there immediately diffuses that potential. And if it's one family member, certainly in that case, it's not a family board. It's one family member, but it diffused that completely. I do think it can be dangerous either side. I mean, it's one of those checks and balances things. I mean, one of the things that was a thing of beauty to watch, and Honey, you've seen it as well with Rebecca, was she did establish a relationship with that
It was
family
amazing.
that allowed, I mean, and let me tell you, there were some granddaddy interpretations in that boardroom over the years in terms of what, you know, what Jay Howard would have thought. But she had a way, and she was, and so there again, that her leadership was extraordinary. And she was a nurse. No, she was. It was not insignificant.
No, I know that.
Psychiatric social nurse?
No.
Pardon?
My wife went to the same school as a nurse, but she came out as a psychiatrist. I always thought that must have been.
No, she was trauma.
God,
actually.
no, I know she was.
That was helpful too, actually.
Very well.
But that was amazing. And, you know, well, I mean, look, as long as we're just passing it around, it's not as though Ed sort of walked in there and immediately had a family and that they were sort of together to bond it. This was an evolutionary relationship, right, Ed?
I have one.
Huh?
Well, they
They
evolved too.
Yeah, they did.
They evolved.
I think it's perfect. It takes a while. But
That's what I meant.
Like a marriage, like anything, it takes a while. I think.
Sorry.
I just add to what you said, because I think Nadya's right. It's this balancing act, and in the case where I worked, in fact, the most thoughtful and empathetic and insightful person was, in fact, the oldest person on the board by many years. He's still alive. He's 99. And if it were not for him, the family would have really fallen in a ditch a lot sooner than it never did. So it wasn't younger people here, it was the oldest of the breed and one of the last 3 surviving folks of the 3rd generation. So it does, every place is a different story.
Let me just interrupt. The man who had the most wisdom on the board when I got there, and I wish to God wasn't already approaching God, I mean, 90 and beyond, was Lee Hills. And today McKinsey called me up asking about some things about the repositioning that Knight's once more going through. I said, go find the last 3 memos Lee Hill wrote. And that was 12 years ago. I mean, you know, and the guy still had a better vision of what the hell and how we ought to be doing it than anything we were able to accomplish.
And what was his role in relationship to the Knight brothers?
He was the consigliere. He created he created first the corporation. He also won 2 Pulitzers as a journalist, and he created the corporation. Then he created the meaning of the foundation. Then he gave the direction to the foundation, and then he gave new direction thereafter. He was a stunning guy. If you saw him in a room of 10, you would pick him 10th to do anything. Upon appearance, and upon delivery, you would wish to God you'd been smart enough to pick him first.
You know, in a way, that also mirrors what happened at other foundations. You think about people who were on the board at Carnegie, that Andrew Carnegie put on there. Elihu Root continued. Elihu Root was his lawyer and was the board chair. And then 40 years later, Elihu Root's son is in the same role. And you look at the continuity between his advisors and him down through the first 50 years or so of the Carnegie Corporation. The same thing happened with Rockefeller. Rockefeller, as you know, himself didn't want to serve on the board, but his people served on the board. And so there are ways of communicating and transmitting the values and the culture of the founder that don't necessarily have to be done only by having children or descendants on there, but it really is an important strand in the culture of foundations. And I thought, and when I did my study, I thought that I detected that the foundation had that culture by and large, that is from the donor some way, either by descendants or by close associates, did a better job, had higher impact than the ones that didn't, by and large.
Interesting. Other folks who are not so close to the foundation world as we tend to be, because we could yak about this for hours. Yeah, go ahead.
That's sort of a random what-if type question. You talked about, I think this is a key point, especially for people who are considering shifting from sort of more grassroots community development to being working in the philanthropic sector. You talked about there's a lot of tedious aspects in the program side, and most of them seem sort of inevitable. No jobs in the world that you love every moment of every task you do. But I'm wondering if if you could identify 1 or 2 areas where you think, in terms of the standard roles and responsibilities of program officers now. I think there's the greatest room for reform to systems or practices that are required to do that kind of interfere with the end objectives of delivering funds to organizations that need them.
Just reframe the question. What I think the core what are the obstacles or challenges right now in terms of core competencies that officers have that may be obstructing foundation effectiveness, or how the role could be shifted?
How a shift you make within the role?
I think it really depends. I mean, I think anyone who has, I've heard this quote, anyone who's been around foundations, if you see one foundation, you've seen one foundation. I'm sure you've heard that quote here. Everyone's different, but I do think that if you're talking about large staffed foundations, which is my little universe, I think that there can be and probably should be, when I talked about the continua of competencies that officers need to hold, I do think that there probably needs to be more explicit recognition of that in foundation leadership. And whether it's, how the structure of how you even interview, because someone has to be able to dance pretty much along those sort of strange continua. But I also think you can start to batch your officers by their own kind of competency and specialty, not necessarily, I think there's room for subject area specialists. You must have them, whether inside the foundation or you access them through consultancies or whatever. But I think you can actually get more explicit about saying, Joe and these three people are really the kind of incubators for new ideas. They're the creative, the first flash people who are out there, and they got networks a gazillion miles wide. They can bring in a lot of fresh thinking and help us search for new ideas and make that happen. Then you could actually have a stable of people who are really your workhorses, who can make that happen and who thrive on managing over the longer term. They're very different, and I honestly don't think there is a single perfect program officer. They all have some deficiency along one of those tensions. I think if you've got the luxury of enough staff, you can in some cases begin to set up some flexibility where you can import the people who are the early stage thinkers, maybe early stage strategists, developing lines of strategy. You've got some people who are implementers. And I think, you've also got some people who love to be administrators, and there's a longer term relationship. And frankly, I think, there's a whole lot of, and I'm sure you've heard this here, a lot of upfront work and thought that goes into being able to prepare and present to these boards. And then a lot of things fall off the cliff. And I would say a lot falls short on the implementation side. And that's tedious work, but some of us, I'm built for implementation. I like doing the creative, innovative stuff, but I'm okay with staying with some things, and I don't need the sexiness of the new. And I think you got to find those people who are, and find an imagination that people have different appetites and different motivations to get out of bed every day, and start using them and deploying them more strategically. There are limits to that. A lot of it has to do with how the foundation grows up. But if you had a tabula rasa situation, you would try to sort of move towards some of that, because I do think people get frozen in jobs where they really, it's not a fit. And they may have had their moment in the sun, their time, their opportunity that was timely, and then sometimes they stay too long. That would be my biggest concern. And they may not be deployed with the things they really are best suited to do. So I guess, I don't know if that answers at all. Yeah.
Thanks for coming, first of all. It's been very interesting to hear all of your insights. I was wondering, as you've researched and worked with different organizations, foundations, over the past several years, you've found certain trends that have been popular in terms of grant recipients that have emerged, either domestically or internationally, just new areas that philanthropies are funding more often. I know that, as you said, you see one foundation, you see one foundation, but if there's anything across the board that you've noticed.
I don't know if I would be interested in my colleagues who are in this world. I wouldn't say that there's necessarily a trend in terms of types of funding. I said certainly the trend, which I know you spent some time on, is much greater push for grantees to demonstrate their effectiveness through impact measures and so on. So there's a much, I would imagine there's more bias toward grantees and organizations that have evaluation systems in place, and probably by their nature must, have to be a little bit better capitalized in order to do that. So I think that, that has the potential to narrow down and eliminate some of the more grassroots organizations. But again, I'm talking from the large U.S. foundation perspective, that might be a trend. I think there are a whole host of other foundations and actors that can keep the grassroots, and ideally, I would like to see that there's some innovation spark and some understanding and appreciation of context of the smaller nonprofits, and not pushing them all through this impact measurement requirement. I actually think more of that, frankly, in some instances, should fall on the foundation in terms of its own accountability for its lines of strategy, and not burdening particularly the smaller nonprofits with as much of that responsibility as I think happens sometimes in a misguided way now. But that would be the one trend. It's not sort of issue. Obviously, issue areas emerge because there are new climate change, right? That's all of a sudden there's a whole lot more organizations in there that never existed. But I think you're talking in terms of trends of funders toward nonprofits. I think exactly.
Christine's question does prompt me to ask you: do you sense that there's more collaboration among foundations today than there was 20 years ago when you started, or you're imagining? As joint funding, particular kinds of things, creating new enterprises. I think of the Energy Foundation as being a good example.
Living Cities is
Living Cities is another example of that. 25 years ago, there wasn't anything like that. I'm just wondering if this is a trend that seems to be developing, or is it just simply a few examples?
I think it's certainly a trend. It certainly has been an aspiration that has increased over the last 20 years among foundations for collaboration. I think I have busted my pick on multi-foundation collaborations, and I'm sure you have too, Lonnie. And we all have. And I think anyone who has survived or not survived a few of those thinks twice. And I think that there is more. I would say, I know at Rockefeller we talked a lot about it's important to look at partnerships in a very opportunistic but strategic way. But I think the worst mistake, I think a lot of foundations in the late 80s, early 90s jumped into collaboration for collaboration's sake. And the opportunity cost of trying to mesh more than, just two foundations working together. We all have our own different grant reporting requirements. You can't believe the bureaucracy, right? We all have our own different operating philosophies, requirements, guiding principles,
and boards
cycles, board
of
meetings, they're all, boards of trustees. So just two foundations, you increase that, the complications exponential. Living Cities, despite the ups and downs of it, and Hadi, you were part of this as well, but then it was, yeah, I can see you shaking but it was, at least there was a pooling of resources, so at least it didn't go through, but that was crazy in its own right. So I think there's a lot of aspirations still, but I think it's probably more practical than it was even 10 or 15 years ago. So, if you want to go into it, so we had a great partnership with Gates on Green Revolution for Africa. That was totally a strategic partnership. It made sense. They were moving in. We didn't have the capital. Boom. And that was it. And so I think you'll see more of that. I think the multi-foundation, most people have learned that's really time-consuming. And at the end of the day, sometimes the lowest common denominator wins on strategy and those things, I would have to say.
The energy level, is perhaps the largest waste in the sense of how much energy it takes simply to maintain the facade, let alone the production. Mm-hmm. Not sometimes it doesn't matter to have the facade, because it does.
Yes, it does.
How do you see the role of private foundations in the current financial crisis?
Speak up again, we can't quite
The
hear you.
role of foundations in the financial
How do you
crisis.
see the role of private foundations in the current financial crisis? The role of private foundations would be bigger than before, or it will be reduced because of the credit crunch?
I actually think that question dovetails well on your question, Joel, because if ever there was a time where foundations should be collaborating, whether in their direct funding, but they definitely need to be collaborating about what they're doing. Because their foundations, I mean, it's a terrible, perfect storm, because of course the grantee community is getting, the need is greater than ever, grantee community is getting nailed. I hate to think what's going to happen at the end of this giving season in terms of personal charity. And foundations are looking, of course, at their endowments having diminished by 30 to 50% in the last few months. And that will not immediately affect most foundations for 2009. 2010, 2011, they all have these rolling, it's going to hit. And this year already, you can feel they're looking at the money in a way they haven't. They will, I think, most of them fulfill commitments they've already made. But new risks, new bets, I think, I worry a great deal about that. And I guess my greatest hope is that, particularly in communities where the relationship to nonprofits is really very much of a sustaining, and there is more of that charitable kind of relationship impact. I think in the communities in which foundations work on the ground, I would really hope that those local networks of philanthropies are communicating all the more openly and candidly about what they can and can't do, and not duplicating effort, not in that sort of we invented it here, this is the only way to approach this issue, but finding some room for meaningful collaboration of thought, not necessarily that they pool their money together, but really mapping out the landscape of what the nonprofit need is. That is a hope. I think I mean, one of the things, I've talked to a couple of local foundations in Philadelphia now that I'm back there, is working potentially. Our city is looking at $1 billion deficit. Most cities, certainly New York, God knows what's going to happen there. And is there a way for the philanthropies, and in some conversations with it, for the foundations to have a more strategic point of contact with the mayor and his administration in terms of what is needed, how can we bring in wisdom and knowledge from other cities and so on. So I hope that's what happens. I'm really concerned because I think you're going to have a non-strategic dissolution of a lot of organizations rather than looking at, there have to be some nonprofits that are going to fail. And foundations, I think, have, if they're good citizens in their communities, they have the potential, frankly, to preside over and help look at the landscape of services needed, organizations there, and help in the thoughtful kind of winnowing that's going to happen. And no foundation wants to be involved in that because that's a nasty business. But they have one of, if not the only, unique vantage points from which to do that, I think. I mean, I'd be interested in others' perspectives on it. But
Well, it is also the case that the opportunity, this is a terrible opportunity to have, that is the shrinkage of resources.
For more years than I remember, foundations have sanctimoniously explained why they were only going to spend 4 to 5% in real monies for their folks, because they were going to have the money when you needed it in the bad times. It turns out having the money was more important than having to use it in the bad times. These are the bad times. Whether there is any sense of obligation beyond making my pile be bigger than yours is going to be tested now. Because in the middle of this great crunch, the instinct to behave like an investment banker instead of a foundation is going to be overwhelmed. And that is wrong. It is dead wrong, and believe me, they'll remember it on Capitol Hill. Because they will say, oh, excuse me, this was the bad times you were telling us about why you couldn't give away more than 5%, right? So why is it you're stretching out? And by the way, quite a few are already stretching out the year of the payment in their obligations, not cutting the money back, just in effect dividing it by a few more years.
Diluting the soup.
Nadya, let me push you on one thing you were saying and see how you think. The opportunity for foundations to collaborate with local government probably has never been better, or more opportune. And yet there's, in my experience, always been, except for a few foundations, kind of like an allergic reaction that foundations don't deal with local government, or with governments generally. There's a piece of, we don't advocate in it, but there's also just sort of a temperamental thing that foundations and governments don't mix it up together very well. Have you seen that? If so, do you think it's going to change? Just the connection between the two sectors. How do you see them playing out?
I agree with you. I think it's remarkable how removed from government foundations can be. I mean, in terms of what goes on. I mean, from a strategy perspective, I will give you an example. You know, back when the Contract for America kicked in, was that 94? You know, we as a foundation at Pew, we had a whole line of strategies, whether education reform, healthcare, blah, blah, blah. And it was sort of striking how long it took to get people to say, hey, just, you know, throw them out the window. It does, I mean, this matters. We have a whole new, yes, we have a beautiful paper that says what we're going to do, but we need to actually shake this up because it's not going to work now. And I think every foundation has the possibility to keep on implementing, you know, excuse the expression, but pissing in the wind, and no one's going to hold them accountable for it. So you're not really in the game. And I hope that now with I think there's a lot of energy around the crisis. I think people are actually seeing that government matters again. I think that we saw some of that in the last election. And perhaps foundations will become more alert and aware of their need, you know, their strategy. It just can't be let 1,000 flowers bloom anymore while, you know, Rome is burning. I mean, I hate to use all these, but, you know, but it is, so I'm actually optimistic that you'll have, I think the leadership is not all right for that, but ideally, I think the aha has happened, I mean, ideally, I don't know, but and I know in Philadelphia, we have one of the William Kent Foundation, Feather Houston, who, she comes out of government. And I have been meeting with her, and she's the person we've been talking about in terms of partnering with city government in a different way. She gets it. I mean, how can you, because the philanthropic, back to your question, philanthropic dollars are de minimis in terms of meeting the human need. But can they be stimulating new approaches for the deployment of government money, which is the way it used to be. You know, the original, the old Robert Wood Johnson research and demonstration, you would try experimental things, you would test it, you would evaluate it, and then the government might come in with something like Stuart B. McKinney Healthcare for the Homeless Act, because it had been demonstrated by foundations that it worked. And then there was a stream of revenue. And I'm, you know, at this point in time, every dollar matters. I think everyone understands that. So innovation, theoretically, is at a premium, and I think foundations should be in the business of helping and partnering to serve that up.
There are counterexamples where foundations and governments have worked together. North Carolina is a very good example, where you had close collaboration between the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, the Babcock Foundation, and the state government, with a number of initiatives that resulted from it. Or I think about locally in Cleveland, the great cooperation between the Cleveland Foundation, the Gunn Foundation, together with local government. So there are plenty of good examples where this has happened. Or you can take, for example, the one you I think alluded to, Ford in the days of Mike Sverdlov. It's a very good example where he was constantly working with the U.S. Department of Labor, with a lot of governmental organizations to ensure that these programs that he wanted to pilot would in fact be picked up. Exactly the same.
So they're good examples. That far back. I mean, Philadelphia right now. I mean, pardon me, Chicago right now.
Chicago, yeah.
I mean, come on. I mean, they're like this in terms of working.
And a lot of schools have, school systems have actually, there've been a lot of partnerships, particularly in educational reform with government around
Pittsburgh, for example.
And Newark Mayor Cory Booker has someone who is really in a who said 4 of the local foundations have hired someone to work as a go-between and really help to coordinate their impact.
Yes.
Well, I had a point building on Professor Fleischman's point that there are too many nonprofits right now. This is potentially a terrible time and a good time for attrition and merging. But how you looking at the foundation sector, there are only going to be more foundations. There's too many foundations in some people's perspectives. Is there a point, should there be a point where there is some attrition there? I mean, you can't really see attrition in foundations potentially, but there are only going to be more foundations, and is that an issue? Is that a problem? They're not necessarily going to work together. We're going to be many more as this kind of next wave generation hopefully has assets.
I don't think it's a problem necessarily. I do agree with the comment that well, honestly I would say if I were really rich, I would rather do the checkbook philanthropy and find myself the talent and so on. The setting aside all that money indefinitely at this point in time, one would have to do that equation maybe a little differently right now. I mean, if you're a family that's just come into money and you want to do something with it, I'm not sure setting it aside in perpetuity in this moment would feel as gratifying, but that would be me. I mean, there's also a whole range of family objectives that go into this. You set these up because you're hoping that finally mom, brother and sister might get along because they have this thing to work on together. And I mean, there's a lot of things that go into the decision. But I will say, I think that the immediacy of this time, it would be too bad if that much more money sort of set off for the future, but it's hard to say it's a bad thing for any kind of charitable impulse to occur. So if it's setting up a foundation, fine. But I do think sometimes it's very cumbersome for what comes out at the other side, and there are easier ways. And when I first started with Judy Roden at Rockefeller, in that first year we were there, I remember, and we were giving out about $130 million a year at that time. And there was a headline about Mayor Bloomberg's philanthropy that year had been $130 million. His checkbook. This wasn't his whatever the emergent foundation is. And I remember saying to her, I said, boy, we sure need to make sure that whatever we're doing, for all this other money we're spending to be us and give away $130 million a year, is justifiable. And I'm truly not fully sure we ever quite solve that. But I think that's the bottom line question anybody has to ask in terms of how you set these things up. And so I don't think it's a problem. I just think it may not be the most effective source, application of resources right now.
One other just add on to that, in Mike's question, is that most of the large wealthy individuals who set up foundations in the last 10 to 15 years have said that they're going to be spend down foundations, not going to be permanently out, and they're in the process. Basically, they say they're giving it away during their lifetime or within a few years thereafter. So you're not getting the buildup now of perpetual foundations that we had prior to that time. The second point is that Katie Harold, is one of our PhD students, is doing a study of foundation closeouts, and she's found that there are a lot more foundations that were created and went out of existence than I had any idea about it. Typically they're the smaller ones, but there are also some large ones that have decided to spend down. But these are foundations that have already closed down that I didn't know anything about, and that she's discovered by going back to the records that the National Center on Charitable Statistics has. So there's a lot more dynamism, a lot more deaths of foundations that we know about, and we're not getting the births of foundations that we did 25 or 30 years ago, perpetual foundations. So I think there's something going on there that we don't quite understand, but it has a lot to do with people's not wanting to create perpetual foundations as much as they did before.
Sir.
Question on the issue of talent in the foundation world. So business pour a lot of money into their own internal leadership development. Into their own leadership development and establishing programs, investing in resources. I've seen regional foundations. Oklahoma, Colorado is one that has an in-depth fellowship program. I've not seen that in as many national foundations. So is that a solution to develop talent for foundations? And if so, what are the ramifications in terms of legal ramifications of spending money internally on staff like that?
Again, I'd be interested in my colleagues' I would say, having invested some time in development of staff, I mean, in terms of, programs to develop staff and so on, and having been a consultant who's made money doing some of that along the way. I actually, at the end of the day, I think I would put a lot more of a premium on being as thoughtful, clear-headed, and explicit about what are the competencies you're looking for in people you hire, and aligning them in the right jobs, running them for as long as that works for, and again, it's got to be an open conversation because I don't think these are permanent jobs, and moving on. I mean, I don't think that it's, I just think that's the most effective use of the resources, is hiring the right people. And Lord knows we made a lot of mistakes. I mean, I can sit here and say, is the people stupid? But we made some really stupid people decisions, even in my, at Rockefeller. I mean, as much as I've been in this, boy, we make some boneheaded decisions there. And I think if you could get the articulation of the competencies needed, what's the job that needs to be done, and getting the right people in the door, and if they're not the right people, moving them out. And I think that is also not a big part of the foundation culture. That's where a lot of waste happens, because you can hire someone who was a great program officer 30 years ago to do X, Y, and Z, and the world changed. And they may have been fabulous, but it's time. And even, I don't care what kind of development you give that person, it's not relevant anymore, whatever that skill set or that subject area, specialty, whatever, it's time. And I think that's where the greatest waste goes. So yes, give people a shot when they're in there, but I honestly, these are pretty typically someone's got to walk in the door and be able to do the job, and you can give them some development, but they either have it or they don't. I mean, I hate to say it, that sounds jaded, and I've just eliminated a line of consulting for myself. I do think it's hard.
But in the field, I know best, that's just wrong. The world of journalism is filled with people who understand everything about it except the new technology. That is to say, they understand all the instinctive things that you want to have in somebody who is going to be providing news and information to the public. These are not old goats like me. I mean, I was at the 70th anniversary of the Neiman Foundation 2 weekends ago. I'm listening to 45-year-olds who are some of the best and brightest in the business, the best, but who are simply neither given the possibility of being trained up in the end quickly into the new platforms, nor indeed have the competencies because they didn't. But what they do have is what the new platforms don't have, which is a set of beliefs about your responsibility with what you provide to the people in terms of news, information, being some level of fair, some level objective, some level fact-based, as opposed to opinion-based. And being able to have training possibilities for them means two things. You retain the core competency, which you want, the very thing that you want out of it, which is people who care desperately about the meaning of a journalism, news and information, which feeds the public's need in a democratic republic, and also allows them to then be, but they have to be trained. They have to be trained, and everybody says we can do it in shop. You can't. Not in this field. I mean, you've got to give them time to go actually be brought up to the scale. And I think there's more than one area like that. This is arguing, of course, from experience. We did send people to school. I mean, and found it was a very useful thing to do. Not for a full year, I would add, but for half, a semester at a time in some of the various programs in schools around the country. And they became more competent. It was a waste of a little bit of time and a little bit of money. And sometimes they took those competencies and went elsewhere.
But you invested in the, I mean, I think, but Hadi, play with me for a minute, because I think, I could totally agree. When you find those folks that have those core competencies, you do whatever, yes, you get them whatever, there's leadership development even, and there's things that they may not have had an opportunity to have.
Right.
But there is that intangible of, people who get it and who really have the potential to soar. And I do think one of the things that, I was talking to my husband on the way down here, that one of the things that I almost kind of think is going to be helpful about this economic crisis for private foundations, the large staffed ones, and it happened in 2001, 2002 when the bubble burst, is they're actually looking a little bit at their administrative expenses, and which doesn't happen often. And I think in almost any foundation you walked into, and this happened in some foundations back then, you ask them, okay, you ask the senior leadership, okay, who are the sort of bottom 10% performers? They could do it in a heartbeat. And there's no point in sending them to those trainings. And those are the only time, and I think that, and it's very hard to get a foundation to sift that out, because they don't really have to. But now there's the focus, and I think you sort of move that out, and so I agree, I was giving a, but I do think some folks, it's just make the call and take it relevant to the present.
Marty?
I want to go back to the discussion about innovation, and it was in the context of the financial crisis and working to meet sort of new extraordinary human needs. So do you see a potential, or any of you actually, for the next couple of difficult years, a foundation sort of shifting from wanting to go after something that's extremely new and innovative, I mean maybe more of a traditional, what they would normally give to sort of jumpstart ideas, and going maybe a little lower on Maslow's hierarchy of needs and actually giving to actually providing human service?
I'll speculate.
Yeah, I know
this is where I have been out of the, my great market timing was to quit one of these jobs in July, and now we're watching this happen. But but I do think, I'm certain that's a conversation happening in every boardroom at some level. I mean, I can't imagine it's not, but I'm not in that currency in an active way right this minute, and others who may be more there could comment. I do think there's a difference. I think there's a big difference between, as I said, folks who are really investing in their communities versus in sort of national or, sort of national idea generation. And I don't know whether you'll see foundations balancing more toward their local portfolio. Like, I don't know if MacArthur is going to put a larger percentage of their money into Chicago and less into some of their national programs. I don't know what that is. I think most of those foundations are pretty clear their resources aren't going to do it anyway. So it's kind of how I really do think there's the greatest potential is around the partnerships with government and the kind of collaboration and mapping, just really doing a landscape of those nonprofit, the needs and the nonprofit services, and even helping government to do that. That's a study that a foundation could do, as opposed to saying, we're going to feed more people, because they don't have the money to do that. And that's, I don't think.
Before the Heritage Foundation wrote the entire outline for the Reagan administration, it was a foundation that wrote the entire outline for the Reagan administration. The 20th Century Fund in the 1930s was writing most of the banking legislation in a red hot heat, sitting there over a weekend, writing it out, handing it off to the guys in Washington in a close cooperation. My only point here being, we do have a lot of ideas, and we do have a lot of talented folk in many of these foundations. And this was a time for a few of the ideas to actually be ahead of the curve, since for the most part they haven't been in this economic thing, but there's a lot to be offered.
Wendy, I'll give you maybe a second take on my experience tells me. When I was doing the work in New York, one of the things that impressed me in a negative sense was that the major foundations of New York City, of which there were 6 or 7, Ford, it was Rockefeller, it was Mellon, it was some of the really heavyweight operations, gave percentage-wise and I think in many cases absolute-wise much, much less money to their local areas than they would give to some other place, nationally or internationally. And I would frequently bemoan the fact that had those foundations put some small percentage of their money into the city, particularly when the city went bankrupt, it would have been vastly different. And if that's one piece of a larger picture, my take is that the traditional foundations that have gone into this kind of work have been the middle and smaller sized foundations. And those are the ones, and the community foundations, and those are the ones that will probably, if anybody does, up their contributions significantly to government and to various kinds of service. They're they're much more likely, and they're closer to the problem, so they may well target better than others. I see less likelihood that the heavyweights will come and do well.
It's just a
There
quick
are
variation
changes.
on the
There are
question.
some changes.
There are some, I'm sorry, Wendy.
I was just gonna put a quick variation on the question. What about large foundations that fund organizations but only to start something new? Do you think there'll be any thought that actually they're in survival mode now, maybe we could just fund them and to be able to do what they're supposed to do?
2 points. I'll respond to the first one first. And not you just think about whether you agree or not, but on the second point, that, many foundations, they've been tarred with the brush of being out of things very quickly, starting them and getting away. But you look at, again, the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation in North Carolina, it's supporting today organizations that started 25 years ago. On a statewide, I'm not talking about just 1 or 2, I'm talking about 25 or 30 or 40. And the same thing is true of Ford. So it's, there are examples of foundations that don't go in for 3 years or 2 years and get out. And there's some even like, we won't even mention the name, where you get in, you have to go out, get 3 years, and then you got to take a sabbatical. But
There are those.
but in any event, so I think that that the foundations, I think about the Duke Endowment, and just take North Carolina, the Duke Endowment in North Carolina, the C. Smith Reynolds Foundation, the Mary Reynolds Babcock Foundation, all of those foundations stick with these organizations that they start. So they're not really just getting in and getting out quickly. I now forgot what I was going to say before.
Sorry, yeah, you cut you off before you start.
Well, one thing I would hope would not happen now is, whether the new lines of work, I don't know, but certainly one would hope that foundations would be, there is a certain pride of ownership, and some foundation, that will remain nameless, but one would hope that there will be less development of brand new nonprofits, because a foundation has a great new idea. This would not be the time to add, I don't think, to that landscape, and I would like to think that's going to diminish, and people will be more imaginative about working with and in partnership with existing organizations, even if it's a shared partnership of thought as to what the strategy should be.
I now remember what I was going to say.
I can fill time. I'll tell you.
No, what I was going to say was that the landscape has changed over the last 10 to 15 years in a way. Ford, I don't think ever really had New York City as a major target, but MacArthur has always had Chicago as a major target. Pew has always had Philadelphia as a major target in a restricted area, and they did a lot in Philadelphia in the arts and later on, I think, in urban development. But Packard Hewlett has always had California as a major target. And you look around the country, and the Gates Foundation, for example, picked Seattle and the state of Washington as a major target. So my sense is that it is now. If I look at the way people set up their foundations, it seems to me that even the large international and national foundations are actually spending more time. I think Rockefeller, if I remember correctly, is actually spending more in New York than it ever did before. So I think that's happening, and I think the pressure of this crisis that we're in right now is going to make it happen even more than it did before. It's still an outlier, but it's happened more than it did before.
Let's do one more question, and then we'll have some sidebar talk after that. Anybody got something that's burning? I'll throw in. Paul, do you have something? No. Joel, we got two. Let's go. Joel.
Question to this whole group. And it's important because we're in a very great state of flux right now. And what would be the group of things that foundations have traditionally done that make less sense now? So foundations work very slowly, very gradually, as you were saying. But if you had a cache of money, what would be opportunities now that just won't ever exist again? I mean, we're going to have lots of change going in the country. And if there was ever a time for foundations that are flexible and adaptable and have money, where would you put that? And I want to get all three of you.
I would do what Nadya suggested. I mean, I think that the redundancy in the nonprofit sector in most regional areas is so striking that if foundations were to get together and to say, we need to be strategic, we've got real problems in these communities, we need to figure out how we're going to deal with them as a group, and we need to facilitate mergers where it's appropriate, we need to put more pressure on to get the organization to be more efficient the way they operate. But if we don't do that at a time like this, we're never going to do it. I mean, so
You would restructure the.
I would use this as an opportunity to restructure the local nonprofit sectors.
Philanthropy to nonprofits drop dead. I mean, you understand, that's,
well,
that's old news.
Everyone drops dead, just some people.
no, but this is a little bit like picking winners in government, okay?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't really have that much faith in foundations' ability to know which are the right ones. I'll be perfectly honest with you.
Yeah, well, that piece, I think that some foundations and some communities could be wise partners in that. I don't think
Some
that
could,
exclusively,
some
some, right? I actually think that the action right now would be, I think that's a piece for those who are really engaged in their communities and have the right legs in the field there. I actually think it's to really shift and for foundations who have not understood how to link into policymakers, because that's where this stuff happens. And I actually think one of this is going to sound strange in a time of economic constraint, but I actually think foundations are the one place where you can afford calculated redundancies. So you can actually, as a foundation, take 3 simultaneous or 5 simultaneous approaches at how you're going to make a better crop or some new teacher reform strategy, and look at it, monitor it, understand it, kill it when it's dead, and nurture the tentacles that are growing. And I actually think that's a really rich opportunity for philanthropy, because government sure as hell can't do that right now. And actually, I really admire, I think the Gates Foundation has done that in some of their, and that's actually, if you think about it, that's what Bill Gates did in his. And so I think modeling that, openness to, we're going to take, a few simultaneous strategies here, and we're going to learn the heck out of it. We're going to be watching for critical milestones, and we're going to pull the plug if it's not working, and learn as we go, and then feeding that in a thoughtful, strategic way with policymakers and being their laboratory for some of that.
I want to be clear that I agree with what Nadya said. I wasn't suggesting that you have only one approach to it, because anybody that's working in the foundation field knows that you do want to have multiple approaches. That's one of the great strengths of foundations. So I wasn't arguing, that we pick one particular approach to a problem and then do away with everything else. I agree completely with what Nadya was just saying.
To that end, I mean, my successor has done a lot of things that I wish I could have done, or had done. But one that he's doing, which is most important in the field, again, I come from a long time ago, is that he is really running programs which invest across the field in attempts to find ways to make the new world of journalism, the new world of technology and news and information work better. And they're spreading it around, by God, and half of them are going to fail so bad, and that's wonderful.
As long as they know.
Because some of them are going to be stunning successes. And some of them may, in fact, be the one that gets us out of the Wild West we're in right now and into something that begins to resemble some kind of, but it doesn't matter. They're doing it really well.
Sounds like venture philanthropy to me.
I'm confident he was wise enough never to use that phrase.
You had a question?
Well, one final question. Actually, building on the venture philanthropy idea, there is a new mini sector within philanthropy right now. And I worked with it this summer called the Acumen Fund.
Oh yeah,
social venture capital group. But
that came out of Rockefeller.
Yeah, definitely.
Way back when.
So how do you develop that set of talent? People who, an Acumen has grabbed a lot of people from the investment banking world, people who know how to evaluate businesses, but don't necessarily understand the social return side, don't necessarily have deep sectoral context, and that's the choice they made, the talent they want. But is that the right? I don't know how much this group has bumped into this sector, and it's still very nascent, but how do you develop that sector, or how would you develop that sector if you had to look at those, how they're staffing up groups like Acumen, and there's a number of other ones?
staff expertise, and they've looked in places that are not traditional. I don't think that you don't necessarily go to other foundations to find your foundation staff. You look at what your strategy is for the social change effort you're engaged in, and if it could be, if it's a small community investment in human services, the acumen people are not going to work. So I mean, to me, I may not be answering your question properly.
No, I'm not sure.
It's just being very clear. What is your foundation trying to do? What kind of relationships is it going to need to establish with external partners and grantees? What kind of skill sets then do we need? And it may be people who have absolutely run nonprofits, NGOs themselves. It may be that you just need the financial analyst because you're doing much more of the sort of social venture investing. But I think that's another case where each of these places is different based on what and they're all different because of who their founders were and what their original mission was. And the importance of mission from the beginning, whether we communicate it matters. And so anyone that's tried to partner or collaborate among different foundations, it's that legacy you're crashing into that makes it unwieldy, because that sets everything in motion. And you can underestimate it, but it really does matter. So, and this one was set up with no family, it was just a project. So it has no, none of that stuff. It's just a sheer business approach to investing. That'd be my simple response.
In the year of our Lord, 2008, on December 3rd, having a hell of a lot of faith in the business models that are given to us by geniuses out of various forms of investment is not exactly high on my list. I mean, a fair amount of humility in this field, as in almost all fields, will go a very long way, because thus far, only the occasional Cassandra who everybody got tired of listening to has been right about any of it over the last 3 years. His name's Krugman, and everybody hates him because he was right all the time.
Honey, we owe you an evening here with us next fall.
I've already been here.
No, you're going to.
She continue to grow.
Oh, yeah. When did you follow up?
Only that this issue of Business Week that just came out this week has the Philanthropy report, Who's Still Giving, and another large article on social entrepreneurship.
Absolutely.
It's an easy read.
Who is?
Well, this
Here's
is
the list of the top 50 philanthropists, but who knows what that, it basically says things aren't really going to shake out for another year until people understand how much money they have. So.
okay. It's time to say thank you. And to remind you that the series starts up again.
January 21st.
31.
Is it 31 or
21.
21. Guys, you're all welcome to return.
And who is the speaker?
I don't know. Can't remember.
I
can only remember one thing at a time.
No, Lisa's the second.
That's next year.
Third term.
That's next year.
Yeah, I don't even remember.
What is it?
Yeah.
Jack.
Oh, Jack, sorry. They just had the service in prison. I'm letting Patty come again.
If we didn't get the number one to come back, we got ahead.